Imagine surviving the horrors of World War II. Years of hunger, bombings, and fear, only to be punished, humiliated, and scarred by the very people you thought would celebrate peace with you. Not by Nazis, not by invaders, but by your own neighbors, your own country. And the reason? Because you were a woman. Because you survived. When the Allied forces marched triumphantly through the streets of France in 1944, the world saw a nation celebrating its freedom. Flags waving, champagne flowing, bells ringing in churches that had been silent for years. But beneath that joyous surface was a hidden nightmare, one that history rarely talks about. As France tried to purge the shame of occupation, a brutal wave of judgment swept across the country. But instead of targeting powerful collaborators or Nazi sympathizers in government, the rage fell on women. Thousands of them, young and old, mothers, daughters, teenagers, some barely out of childhood. In village squares and city streets, crowds gathered, not to celebrate, but to punish. Angry mobs, filled with righteous fury and national shame, dragged women from their homes, tore off their clothes, shaved their heads bald, and painted swastikas on their foreheads. And these weren't just one-off events. They were spectacles, public performances of humiliation. Photographed, cheered, watched by men, women, and children alike. These women were called Les Tondues, the shorn. Their punishment, being accused of sleeping with the enemy, of fraternizing with German soldiers during the occupation. But here's the truth. Many of them weren't traitors at all. Some of these women had relationships with German soldiers, yes, but the reasons were never simple. Some fell in love, others were lonely, isolated, abandoned. Many were raped. Others worked in German-run factories just to survive. Some accepted food from soldiers to keep their children alive. During a time when men were gone, fighting, imprisoned, or killed, women were left to fend for themselves. And when the Nazi occupation collapsed, that complex truth was tossed aside. They were labeled collaboratresses horizontals, horizontal collaborators. Survival became a crime. And the punishment was public disgrace. Think about that. You live through 4 years of fear and deprivation. You keep your family alive. You make impossible choices. And when liberation comes, instead of safety, you're tied to a chair. Your head is shaved. You're spat on, laughed at, photographed. Sometimes your children are watching. Sometimes they're punished too. But this wasn't just about justice. It was about image. France, humiliated by years of occupation and its own collaborationist government, needed to cleanse itself, needed to show the world it had resisted. But how do you prove resistance when your own leaders worked with the Nazis? Simple. You find scapegoats. And women, especially vulnerable, visible women, became the easy targets. Men who had profited from the war, who had sold supplies to Nazis or informed on Jews, often escaped public scrutiny. But women? Women were dragged into the spotlight and destroyed. For decades, these women didn't speak. They couldn't. To talk was to relive the shame. Some tried to rebuild their lives in silence. Others were never able to. They lived with the scars, mental, physical, emotional. Their children inherited that silence. Their stories weren't in textbooks. They weren't in the documentaries. Because in the eyes of a country trying to rebuild, there was no room for the messy truth of survival. Only the clean myth of heroism. The public head-shaving ceremonies were horrifyingly organized. In one case, a mother and daughter were marched through the streets, jeered at by a crowd who had once been their neighbors. Their heads shaved, their clothes torn. One historian described it as a form of symbolic rape, stripping women not just of dignity, but of identity. And it worked. France moved on. The war ended, but these women didn't forget. And neither should we. Today, historians are finally unearthing their stories through letters, diaries, photographs that were once trophies but now serve as evidence. And what emerges is not a tale of betrayal, but of brutal injustice. These women weren't just survivors of war. They survived shame. They survived judgment. They survived silence. Their pain shows us the high cost of collective guilt and the danger of rewriting history to make ourselves feel better. Because when we look back on war, we often celebrate the victories, the flags, the heroes. But real history, the kind that matters, is found in the stories we try to forget. The women whose heads were shaved didn't lose their dignity. France did. And the least we can do now is remember.